Justice Chalmeshwar, Judge of the Supreme Court, Justice Alam, Shri Mukul Rohtgi, distinguished gentlemen of the dais, ladies and gentlemen. I'm grateful to Justice Alam and his colleagues for having invited me to associate with this inauguration of the seminar on the TDSAT, its adjudicatory functions and the future as we see it. So I'm also grateful to you for allowing me to speak out of turn because I have to be present at a state finance minister's meeting in a few minutes from now. I was listening to Justice Alam's analysis of the things that they stand as far as the disputed adjudicatory mechanism in the telecom and the broadcasting sector is concerned. He's right when he says that in his opening comments that the two important factors which have impacted human life are empowerment and eventually will also have an impact on the legal adjudication. One is the nature of the economy as it is growing, and the second is the impact of technology on that economy itself. And there can't be a better living example of this than the two sectors that you regulate, which is telecommunication and broadcasting. If you just look back a little more than 2 decades ago, these were the two most regulated sectors of the Indian economy. And if we look at how they evolved and where situations stood at that time, in broadcasting, the world started getting television in the late 1940s. For some reason, because of our regulated thinking, we got it about 20 years after the rest of the world. And even in the decade of the 80s, we were still debating whether to have color television or not. That was actually the impact on our thought process which the regulatory mechanism itself had. I remember sometimes in the 1990s, the governments at that time still thought that broadcasting was exclusively a state monopoly. It was only by a freak coincidence that one of the cases relating to telecast of a sporting event came to the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court decided that broadcasting as a part of free speech should be made available to any citizen, and that's how the explosion in the last 20 odd years took place. Even when we opened up telecom, there was always a fear of the unknown. And of course, we were quite content with an inadequate or virtually no service. Because when we opened up telecom in India, the tele-density of this country was 0.8%. Less than 1% of people in India had connectivity to telephone. And in almost 2 decades, we very proudly say that we've become the fastest growing telecom economy with over 100 million phone connections. And our initial experimentation at the regulatory mechanism was, when we opened up telecommunications for private sector, there was a conflict of interest that the government itself had. the government itself ran a telecom company, which it still does, the MTNL and the BSNL. And the government was also virtually the regulator. So the government would decide the rules of the game, and the government was also a participant. Obviously, private sector investors had their own doubts whether they would like to invest in an environment where a competitive player was also the rule-setting agency, because he'd wear two hats at the same time. And that is one of the reasons why we went in for this mechanism of creating a regulatory mechanism. And when we created this regulatory mechanism, it ran into another trouble. And that trouble, with Justice Alam, I'm glad he pointed out today, is partly because of the fact that judges hate to be told that they have no jurisdiction. And therefore, every time the telecom regulator took a decision, that decision was challenged somewhere in the country before a high court. And because of this indefinite jurisdiction that they have, issues which were decided by the regulator and which were obviously subject to some judicial review, it would take years before its turn would come up before the high courts. And therefore, the regulatory mechanism itself got defeated because those decisions could never be implemented. They were stayed by some high court or the other. And at that stage, the government thought that this traffic jam itself can't be allowed. And that is how this whole concept of an appellate authority whose decisions could be directly appealed to the Supreme Court itself was born out. I was then in the government and I was associated with a fast-track mechanism by which the act was split up. And therefore, the essential elements of the split up was that TRAI itself would become the rules, the regulation setting agency, the regulator, but you required a special telecom court. This court would have an appellate authority jurisdiction over the TRAI, and this telecom court also would be a dispute settlement mechanism between the government and an operator, or between an operator and an operator itself. And I would say, by and large, this experiment has worked satisfactorily. And I can share with you one of the reasons why broadcasting jurisdiction was given to the TRAI. Because as technology was moving fast, it was only at that stage it was realized that we were moving towards an age of convergence. And because we were moving towards an age of convergence, the same carriage mechanism, the same satellite mechanism, and the same instruments would ensure that telecommunication and broadcasting converged into one. And therefore, while fixing tariffs, while adjudicating disputes, you could not really demarcate between the two. And as the Act itself is drafted, I think, if I remember correctly, the provision itself said government by notification may say that telecommunication definition would include broadcasting. That if convergence were really to happen, then broadcasting itself would get included within the jurisdiction itself. Today, as the institution has by and large functioned well, You have thrown up a new challenge to the entire thought process, and that challenge is that even when the acts are framed with the best of intentions, the ingenuity of lawyers and the unlimited jurisdiction of judges creates a situation of a divided authority. Parts of the same issue or some parts of the same cause of action are pending before one authority, some parts will be also pending before courts. I am personally of the opinion that once we have brought the matter to a telecommunication court, I am using that word almost as a synonym for the TD-SAT, the issue has its own strengths and virtues. When you create a specialized institution, it may comprise of a judge, it may comprise of a technical member, a finance member, with an institutional experience of dealing with dozens and dozens of matters within the same subject. Their understanding and their ability to resolve it, I think, becomes a part of that institutional capacity. And therefore, there is a good case behind what you suggest, that cases getting out of there into some other jurisdictions not only would lead to an extra complication, extra delay, part of the issue being decided by one authority, part of the issue being decided by the court. And I'm sure since you flagged the issue, it's an issue worth consideration. I wish my friend Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad had been here. He's traveling to the US. But I will certainly bring it to his notice that it will require some element of reconsideration. What the alternate mechanism of dealing with the smaller issues is concerned, particularly relating to broadcasting, because you feel that it's flooded with broadcasting disputes. I think with the experience of the TD-SAT, if you could make certain suggestions with regard to the alternative dispute redressal mechanism, because those are also issues which have to be adjudicated and adjudicated quickly. And experience is that if you take it out and leave it to the jurisdiction of the civil courts, then probably the issues can get indefinitely delayed. And therefore, what that alternative mechanism could be, has it to be some other mechanism under the Act, etc., which has to be created. I'm sure the government would always be too willing to look at it, so that the time and energy of the TD-SAT is really spent on larger commercial issues and issues relating to how the technology itself is going to play out in the coming years itself. I think you deal with a sector which is where the best in that sector is still to be seen. I say this because how technology will evolve over the next few decades, nobody really can visualize today. In fact, the world is now talking of the fourth industrial revolution. Many of the earlier ones bypassed India. Some have only partly touched us. And therefore, if the fourth has to be technology driven, there are a few inherent advantages we have. We have a large pool of human resource, the large network of educational institutions which is producing these trained minds. Fortunately, unlike other sectors, this remained an unregulated sector, and therefore, in technology-related matters, inherently in the last 2 decades or 2-3 decades, we've done well. This is a sector in which our IT sector particularly our telecom sector has shown that if allowed to go unregulated, it has a capacity to grow. In fact, the whole institution of startups itself is finding technological solutions to the present day problems. And if we look at the manner in which those solutions have been found by people, it's incredible. I repeatedly mentioned that the solution found by somebody who created a transport company without owning a vehicle and became the largest transport institution in the world today. It's a technology-based solution which has resolved the transport problem in cities and towns across the world. E-commerce itself has changed the entire landscape of retail trade world over. They're the largest retailer in the world, doesn't own a store. This is what technology can do. These are the kind of jobs really it can create. Now, these are all sectors which are going to emanate out of this. Now, the world is today discussing whether will this lead to conventional job losses, or you lose jobs in some sectors and create them elsewhere. And therefore, the impact of this unknown itself is to be visualized. So I'm sure the regulatory mechanism, the appellate authority mechanism, the dispute adjudicatory mechanism will have to be extremely agile, competent, and I think we'll have to continuously keep updating it to keep pace with these changes itself. I'm sure over the next few hours and tomorrow you'll probably be able to come out with some of the responses which will be extremely good to the sector which you are regulating. And probably this is a sector which holds the key for a very large sector of India's economy itself. I wish your conference, Justice Alam, a great success.